Okay. So, I want to kind of share some information with you guys on setting boundaries with children and teens. I know that that can be kind of a hard thing to do with kids in care, and it can also be really important. So, hopefully, this training will help give you guys some ideas on what you guys can do to maybe improve some of that. And I know some of you guys are joining. I'm getting you marked in if you're just now joining us. So, I know this is lunchtime. If you guys need to step away for a minute from your computer, that's fine. Just, excuse me, step away from your camera, turn it off for a second, come back. If you're eating, that's fine too. If you have questions throughout, feel free to unmute and just um, ask the question, or you can ask it in chat as well. Usually I will see that and be able to answer pretty quickly, but if not, you can just ask a question. I think that's kind of the housekeeping stuff. Try to be on camera. Children's Alliance really wants you on camera for you to get credit. So I won't be like watching you the whole time, but I will kind of check in and make sure you're on camera. So if that's helpful for you. My name is Jennifer Danford. I am a foster parent trainer with KVC. I work in the Topeka, Lawrence, Hiawatha area. I've been with child welfare for a long time, since the early 2000s. But I've only been with KVC in the trainer as a trainer since January of this year. I really enjoy kind of getting to know foster parents, working with them, helping them with areas of need, and then kind of getting to learn from them as well. Kind of early on in this, I recognized that helping parents find some ideas with setting boundaries with kids was a big thing to work on. A lot of kids who come into care struggle with boundaries, struggle with understanding appropriate boundaries. And so this was a really big topic that came up in a lot of my referrals and those kind of things. So that's what we're going to talk about for the next hour. So, like I said, feel free if you have any questions or anything like that to go ahead and shout those out. But what I really want to talk about today are what boundaries are, why they're important, maybe talking about briefly how trauma kind of goes into how come kids struggle with boundaries, and how it affects their thoughts, beliefs, and behavior. And then you guys are interested, I'm sure, in some interventions that can be helpful in setting some boundaries. And then I'm going to talk briefly about self-care because that is a really good way to work on boundaries and really set yourself up so that things work a little better. So here are just some questions to think about, and you don't have to answer them out loud, but have you ever finished a project for your child because it was easier than arguing? Have you accepted part of the blame for their behaviors? Have you avoided negative issues out of fear for their response? Are there areas where you have given your child more than one last chance? This is your last chance. Okay, this is your last chance. Have you begun to feel that you're at the end of your rope? Has a situation in your home reached the point that you have anxiety when you're at home sometimes? Like you maybe avoid? Are there other areas where you feel dread? Like if the phone rings during the day, maybe it's a call from the school. Have you noticed growing resentments in other family members? Maybe bio kids or spouses or extended family, physically or emotionally distancing themselves from you or the child. Have you noticed an increase in negative behaviors? So if you answered yes to any of those questions, there could be boundary issues in your home. So what are boundaries? Boundaries are lines that establish what we will accept of another person's actions or their words. I know boundaries is kind of a key word these days. We see it a lot on social media, those kind of things, but maybe we don't actually break it down and figure out what it is. But boundaries are what we will accept, and they're necessary in all healthy relationships. We make boundaries out of love, but not out of revenge or to shame or punish. And we do them intentionally because we have the best interest of our family and children in mind. So we can kind of break down some types when it comes to boundaries, but boundaries are really everywhere. Some of the types are physical. That's kind of an easy one to imagine. We have personal space. We have limits of, how much we can take when it comes to being touched. So can our foster kids. When we can be touched, how often we can be touched. So physical boundaries are important. Material boundaries. This is one that a lot of our kids struggle with. Maybe when it comes to our things. I think a lot of kids who come into our homes either think everything's for everyone or maybe kind of hoard their things. And so we have to be very intentional sometimes about talking about what the boundaries look like in our homes, and talking about what is ours and what is theirs. And we teach that to young children, to toddlers, when they first start playing with toys. This is something we share. This is something we don't share. This can be yours. This can't be yours. But sometimes kids miss those lessons. Mental boundaries. This is also hard sometimes for kids in care to learn that not everybody has the same thoughts, values, or opinions as them, and that we don't have to coerce people into having those things, and that when we do cross that boundary, that becomes a bullying sort of behavior. And then maybe emotional boundaries, that we all have different emotions and that we need to be aware of how our actions maybe affect other people. And that's a tough one that we're teaching the whole time we have kids in care, or that we have kids in our home, that maybe even our own kids, that we are responsible for our own emotions and choices. And there are other boundary types that aren't on here. Financial boundaries, talking about money, talking about those kind of things. Those can be significant boundaries that can be crossed as well. So, why are boundaries so important? Why do we need boundaries? It's a form of self-care. It shows other people how we need to be treated. It also shows other people what we are saying is acceptable. We show other people what we need to be respected and safe. It's a way we can role model for these kids in our home as well. They need to be able to have good boundaries. And if we're not role modeling that, they won't be able to have that. So boundaries can help us avoid burnout, stress, and anxiety, which it's really easy to fall into that as foster parents, to have burnout, stress, and anxiety. We don't want you guys to have that. So being intentional about boundaries and being aware of boundaries can help avoid some of that, so that you guys can stay in this field longer and have a better experience as foster parents. Okay, so I don't know how familiar you guys are with Brene Brown. She does a lot of research on shame and vulnerability, but this is a quick video where she talks about boundaries and how they are important. And she kind of says it better than I do. So we'll watch this.
One of the most shocking findings of my work was the idea that the most compassionate people I have interviewed over the last 13 years were also the absolutely most boundaried. Because
most boundary.
So I'll give you a great definition of the definition of boundary that I use in the book. Boundary is simply what's okay and what's not okay. What I think we do is we don't set boundaries. We let people do things that are not okay or get away with behaviors that are not okay. Then we're just resentful and hateful. Me, I'd rather be loving and generous and very straightforward with what's okay and what's not okay. And I did not, that I learned from the research. I was the exact opposite. I assumed for the first 35 years of my life that people were sucking on purpose just to piss me off. Mm-hmm. That's what I assumed. Yeah, right. Whether it was someone who worked for me or it was family member who was constantly like, I was always critical and judgy. And I was like, why are they choosing these things? Why are they making their choices? They should know better. And then when this thing came up from my therapist, what if people are doing the best they can? I thought my husband had the most beautiful answer to that question. He said, I'll never know whether people are doing the best they can or not. But when I assume people are, it makes my life better. So now I think I am not as sweet as I used to be, but I'm far more loving.
It's not just some like technique so that you can do that. That's really like a way of being to like nurture that soil of wholeheartedness.
Yeah. Generosity, to assume the best about people, is almost an inherently selfish act. Because the life you change first is your own.
Love yourself.
Yeah. And so my question is big, B-I-G. What boundaries need to be in place for me to stay in my integrity and make the most generous assumptions about you? But generosity can't exist without boundaries. And we are not comfortable setting boundaries because we care more about what people will think, and we don't want to disappoint anyone. We want everyone to like us, and boundaries are not easy. But I think they're the key to self-love, and I think they're the key to treating others with loving kindness. Sustaining. Nothing is sustainable without boundaries. I think compassion and empathy are different things. And again, I'm relying on my data for this. I think compassion is a deeply held belief that we're inextricably connected to each other by something rooted in love and goodness. I call that God. Not everybody calls that God. My dad would call it fishing.
Fishing?
Fishing? No, there's no G in fishing. But I think compassion is a deeply held belief. I think empathy is the skill set to bring compassion alive. So empathy is something we can teach. I mean, it's something we've taught our kids since they were very little. It's about how to communicate that deep love for people in a way so that people don't know they're not alone. I think there's a lot of new and interesting information out there about empathy not being a good thing, about that, there's an argument that says, if Travis is in struggle and I practice empathy with you, I'm taking on your darkness, and it leads to burnout but empathy is not feeling for somebody. It's feeling with them. It's touching a place in me that knows where you've been. So I can look at you and say, me too, brother. You're not alone in this. And I find empathy to be infinite. I think it gives back tenfold what you put out.
It's sustaining. Like if you've done the work and you have your boundaries, I mean, you could tread that water forever and never get tired.
Okay, so empathy. I'm quoting Travis here. Empathy. If you've done your work and set your boundaries, you can tread that water forever. Amen. It's not finite. And it keeps giving back to us. And so this idea that, but here we go back to where we started this conversation. Empathy minus boundaries is not empathy. Compassion minus boundaries is not genuine. Vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. So you see that there's a huge riff here, which is boundaries are freaking important.
Right.
And they're not fake walls. They're not separation. Boundaries are not division. They're respect. Here's what's okay for me and here's what's not.
Yeah, okay. So that's a really helpful lens to look at that through, is that we have to have boundaries in order to make a lot of those things work, like empathy and compassion. And she says that very well. So I just want to kind of go through some of the things, changes that we see in some of our kids, just normal changes, because I think it's important to have a baseline. But when we're looking at kids 12 to 14, we're going to see some things like more concern about how they look. They're going to start focusing on themselves more. A lot of times they have high expectations and then they'll go back and forth between a lack of confidence. We see more moodiness. We see more of that peer pressure and influence by their peer group. We see that they have show less affection towards their parents or caregivers sometimes. They can seem rude or short-tempered. They start feeling some more stress from schoolwork at times, and they can have eating problems. When they start to get this age, they can have more sadness or depression. They have feelings that are deeper. So you can see things like poor grades, alcohol, drug use, unsafe sex, and other issues. When we're looking at even older kids, they have a deeper capacity for romantic relationships. Conflict. Sometimes we'll see more independence. They will have more intimate relationships. Sometimes they spend less time with you guys and more time with friends. And again, the same ability to have that deeper feelings of sadness and depression, and they can have some acting out behaviors. So that is why setting boundaries with foster youth can be difficult, is sometimes they're going through some of those changes, as well as they sometimes come from homes that lack stability, where they might have, in a home that has more stability, they may see boundaries role modeled more appropriately. And so when they come from homes that don't have those boundaries role modeled into a home that has more stability and structure, that's where we see some issues. So yeah, so reasons for struggling. Our kids who come into care often come from environments without healthy limits and relationships. That can look like, uninvolved parents, or it can look like over-involved parents. But regardless, it can be really difficult to shift. They struggle to apply proper boundaries in their interactions with people. Sometimes when you guys start to set those boundaries, there is a painful conflict. They react very poorly. They might start tantruming, or you might see your relationship with them suffer because they don't like having those boundaries, or those boundaries feel foreign to them. And then neurologically speaking, setting those boundaries can actually change their brains, because they weren't, they didn't have boundaries to begin with. So I'm going to talk about trauma briefly, because the trauma does build into why the boundary setting is hard. So just briefly, trauma is actually an emotional response to an event. It's not actually the event that happens. Sometimes people can go through traumatic events and respond just fine. And sometimes people go through these events and they have a lot of effects happen to them. So this harm that causes the emotional response can actually be physical, emotional, real, or perceived. So, for example, it doesn't have to be a actual physical thing that happens. It can be a perceived harm. It can be someone at school saying they're going to hurt you, saying they're going to physically hurt you, and that's a perceived harm. That's like a bullying event, and that can be traumatic for sure. So it can also result from a one-time single event or exposure to multiple events over time. Single event would be like a car accident. Multiple events could be something that our kids have experienced, like physical abuse or sexual abuse that happens time after time. So, in our kids that have trauma, especially in teens, we see them either talk about it a lot or actually just deny that it happened. They may not follow rules, they may talk back, they may have issues with sleeping. A lot of times we see them sleep more or less. They may have nightmares, risky behaviors, fighting, not wanting to hang out with friends, or actually using drug or alcohol, running away, or getting in trouble with the law. Signs of trauma in younger kids could be the same things. Sleep issues, eating issues, regression. A lot of times in younger kids, we see things like wetting the bed, baby talk, those kind of things. So, trauma and attachment. Trauma definitely impacts attachment, which can lead to boundary issues. So, it creates an insecure attachment pattern, which means that they are not able to have a regular attachment with adults, especially caregivers. So they don't trust, and they don't connect to you like they would a normal caregiver. They could have reactive aggression towards authority figures and peers because they can't connect to you and trust you like a normal kid who wouldn't have attachment issues. That can come out as being aggressive, not respecting that you're an authority figure. A lot of times we see that our kids get in trouble at school a lot with teachers, community leaders, those kind of things. And then we see a lot of trouble empathizing with others' feelings. A lot of times our kids don't understand how they are impacting other people's feelings. And then the boundary issues, of course. So this even goes to the brain level. I talked earlier briefly about how when we do start setting boundaries, it changes brains in our kids. It actually changes some things in their brains. Well, trauma does too. When a kid has experienced something like abuse or neglect, they actually lose functioning in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the higher level of our brain. It's in the top front and it's responsible for logic and reasoning. So our kids a lot of times do struggle with things like logic and reasoning. Here's some brief overview of the brain and how trauma affects it. So here's kind of a little map. The red part is kind of the brain stem, and the brain develops outwards. So the brain stem is our survival state. This is where kids are at a lot when they are struggling. This is what develops first, and this is where kids are when they're in trauma or when they are in their lowest state, when they're tantruming, when they are not able to interact well. So when they're in this base level, it's really, they are really asking the question, am I safe? They are only concerned with safety. And so the only way to really interact with them and calm them is to create safety for them somehow, to nurture them. The second level is the emotional state, the blue level. And this is the mid level. This is still when they're tantruming, coming out of a tantrum, starting to tantrum. They are not capable of reasoning. They are not logical. They're probably only semi-verbal, but they're really struggling still. This is the area where they are wanting to be loved. And so the only way to really connect to them in this area is through connection, finding a way to connect with them. Where we want them to be is that executive state, which is what I just talked about in the last slide, which is the prefrontal lobe, which is right up front. This is where they can reason, they can be logical. You can actually talk to them about boundaries, about rules, about structure, those kind of things. And that is where they can actually, their brain can say, what can I learn from this situation? So if you can kind of recognize some of those behaviors and meet them in those states, they're more likely to be able to move towards the green prefrontal lobe. So what can this look like? We have to remember that all behavior does serve a purpose and all behavior is learned, right? Like when we are babies, we don't know anything. We learn everything. We learn that crying brings us food or brings us being held. So our kids, when they come into our home, they've learned that their behavior brings a response. Sometimes those behaviors are very maladaptive, and that's the issues that we're kind of trying to address through this, boundaries. So we do have that manipulation, but youth manipulate because they want or need something. And typically that happens because that behavior has worked for them before. For example, being suspended at school or getting in trouble at school. They've learned that if they act poorly, they don't have to learn in the classroom. That's too frustrating for them. They've learned that they can get out of school and stay home. And maybe at their home of origin, they just watched TV or played video games. And so those behaviors are frustrating to us because that's not how we would address them, but it did work for them at some point. And so we have to remember that all of their behavior had a purpose at some point, and it might take a lot of time to reteach those kind of things. So they do continue those behaviors for some time until it doesn't work well. I mean, we do the same things. So let's get back to setting boundaries. What are some things we can do to be helpful with some of these kids that have trauma, are stuck in different areas of their brain, have a lot going on? Clearly identify our boundaries. We need to talk, I think I'll talk about this later probably, but we need to talk with our spouse or whoever is in our family and figure out what's important in our family and be very intentional about setting boundaries and what that looks like. We need to understand why we need the boundary. Like, for example, if you have rules in your home around cell phones or something, then you need to be clear about what that is and why that is the case. And then be straightforward that this is the rule and this is what's going to happen. I'm not saying you're not going to have any kickback from, the child about that. But if you're clear and understand it, why you need it and be straightforward, that is helpful to them to have some of that information. Otherwise, their brains sometimes make up narratives that aren't true, like this foster parent just doesn't like me. When really, it might be none of us have our cell phones except for the grown-ups because you need to sleep at night or whatever. Don't apologize or give long explanations. That is not necessary. You really just need to give an explanation. And don't get into arguments even though it's really hard, but being as calm as you can while setting the boundary. So it is easier to start with tighter boundaries. I know sometimes that's difficult when you have kids moving in and out. Sometimes a lot of you guys are foster families. You may not just have one placement. You might have several. So those boundaries change, but it's easier to start with a tighter boundary and address boundary violations early. letting them know, hey, I noticed you got home from school, at 4:30, and we talked about you being home at 4. Let's talk about that. Otherwise, again, these are kids, they're going to push boundaries anyway, regardless if they're in care, but specifically if they've had trauma or they haven't had boundaries in the past. And so it's our responsibility to teach them boundaries and kind of address these. If you cannot make it personal and just say, again, this is the house rule, I expect this from everyone who's maybe in middle school at my house or 6th grade. I know everyone in your home doesn't probably have the same boundaries, but making sure that they know it's not personal. And using a support system if you have a spouse or anyone else. Trusting your intuition is always good. So, what works with enforcing boundaries with children and teens with trauma? Being firm and consistent is always helpful. Again, they need stability. They need that. They need that consistency. They haven't maybe had that. It's unlikely they've had it, and so that's really good for them. That does tell their brain that they're loved. That does create safety, having that that just stability. So even though they may kind of buck against that over time, that does create safety for their brain. So sitting down with whoever else is in your home, other parents and caregivers, and being intentional to establish what boundaries are important in your home. Maybe going back to that list of physical boundaries, material boundaries, emotional boundaries, going back to that list and maybe thinking ahead of time what's important. And you can think of boundaries as rules too, but sometimes boundaries are more than rules. So sitting down and kind of thinking about what that might look like ahead of having a placement, but you can do it even if you do have a placement. You can include them in that conversation if they're old enough. And if your youth doesn't follow through with those boundaries, making sure they do have a consequence, even if that's just talking to you about it, having a conversation, or having a consequence that kind of matches up with that boundary violation. But that way they know that that stability and consistency is expected and that they can't step out of that stability and consistency. That's so good for their brain to establish some of that safety. So in terms of consequences, allowing for natural consequences is really one of the best things we can do if it's possible. Some situations result in natural consequences and it's hard, but it's best if we can resist the temptation to take care of these consequences. An example is if a teen breaks or loses a phone. I know it can be inconvenient, but maybe allowing for them to not have that or to borrow an old phone until they can pay for it or something like that. But that way they've learned about how they've, violated that boundary, and it feels more natural to them and they may not do that again. Whereas if we hurry up and get them a new phone because it's easier for everybody, and then we ground them for a couple days, that's not going to have the same impact. We can't always do natural consequences, so sometimes we have to figure out what that looks like. So choosing consequences that match the behavior and consequences we can stick to is the best thing. So if they're, late after school or late after curfew, make it a curfew consequence, like maybe curfew's earlier, or maybe you pick them up from school instead of they ride the bus or something like that, so that it is connected. So another thing is knowing what life lessons you want to teach. It's really hard to cover all boundaries and figure out all the things we want to do for these kids that come into our home because it can be overwhelming. Um, but what is the big thing in your family that's important? Is it all of our families have kind of a theme, you know, all of our families have values that are important. Is it respect, integrity? What is it important to you? Um, and tie some of those boundary violations to that value. Um, you were home late from school. You know how we feel about respect in this family. That that does not show respect to our time because you know we leave to go to soccer practice or whatever. Or integrity. That's not that's not showing integrity because you were dishonest about it. That way everything's kind of tied to one or two values and they're starting to learn some values along with those boundaries. That helps you pick your battles as well because then you become exhausted if you struggle over every single thing. If you can start kind of tying them to larger values, it helps kind of bundle some of the things that they're doing in your home. So sit down with your spouse or if you're managing this on your own and figure out what the overarching thing you want to teach them and start kind of tying it to that. I know you guys are um, people who have empathy and compassion, otherwise, you wouldn't be fostering. So I don't say this in a flippant way, like you're not doing it, but um, making sure you do offer that empathy and compassion. Today's teens and youth, even elementary school, have a very high level of stress, even topping levels reported by adults. Um, I mean, this is probably because of social media and education and political things. So, and especially if they're in care. So they have a lot going on. That doesn't excuse their inability to be um, respectful and kind and follow boundaries. But just knowing that can maybe help you when you're dealing with some of this stuff. And when you can utilize that empathy and relate to them, it can help these boundary discussions a little bit sometimes. Giving respect to get respect. I think it goes both ways, but I think a lot of times it is helpful if we can give respect in small ways. Like, I think our youth's feelings are very real and very big, regardless if we understand why they're that way. Um, so not dismissing their large feelings, their big feelings, even if the behaviors that result from those feelings are not appropriate. So um, trying to separate the two and help them separate the two. Another thing that's helpful is giving them as much privacy as safety allows. If you can give them a whole room of privacy, that's great. If you can give them a cell phone, that's great. I know sometimes some kids cannot have any privacy at all because of some safety issues, but the more privacy they can have, that gives them a little bit of agency, and that's helpful. This one's hard, trying not to take things personally. Kids can really make things personal. Our youth who are in care, I think, have an uncanny ability to kind of um, find our buttons and reach them. I think probably because they have such good survival skills from some of the trauma they've been in. But to kind of help with not taking things personally, remembering that these kids still need us, even if they won't say that or admit it. They do still need someone to care for them. They need caregivers, they need homes, they need that safety, they need that security. So trying to step back and remembering that. Um, you are allowed to take a break. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to disengage if they are um, if it's too much and to come back to a conversation. Sometimes reminding yourself, you're the grown up here. Especially with teens, they can really try to pull you in. So trying to avoid that. So again, setting some boundaries, like I talked about, having that intentional conversation. Sometimes that's really helpful if you get a new placement within the first week to sit down and not have it be, these are all the rules, but sit down and say, hey, and that's why I say the first week, maybe not the first night. Hey, this is some of the boundaries we have in our house, and this is why we have these boundaries. And maybe really just being very straightforward and honest, maybe listening to their responses, and being willing to actually listen to their words and seeing, if there's any things that you would be willing to change on that. Because that could be helpful. Having a reason to explain why you have the boundaries is really helpful. You don't have to, but I think it does help when it comes to having them follow your boundaries and being respectful towards them. Starting small. So knowing this about boundaries, some rules are like unbendable. So you might have some boundaries like we don't hit people. We don't have violence in the home. We don't have substances in the home. These are not boundaries that are going to change. If you say these things, though, just recognize that some kids will try these boundaries to see if you will kick them out, because they are going to want to see if you will love them enough to keep them if they do the boundaries you say are unbendable. So be careful with the unbendable boundaries, but knowing some rules are unbendable. Some rules are just going to be cultural to you guys, and that may be like everybody eats dinner together, or we don't say certain words in this family. There's just going to be some rules that are just you guys. And then some rules are flexible. So this is where it gets tricky with kids. Like, you might have a teenager who gets to play video games for 2 hours a day, an hour a day. But you might have in the same home a second grader who gets 30 minutes a day. And now that second grader is saying, well, he gets to play more. That's when you get to say, well, you know what? Some rules change as you get older. And so you get to explain that not all rules are the same for every age, and not all rules are the same for every person. So you might have two teenagers in the house and one gets a phone and one doesn't. So that's where it gets kind of dicey, but you're going to have to be able to explain why that's the case. And you're the grown up, so you get to choose that. As long as you can, as long as you can explain why. You don't even have to explain why, but I would suggest you do. That's how it goes. So just want to talk briefly about compassion fatigue, because if we don't take care of ourselves, we can't handle boundaries, we can't handle rules, all of those things. So this is pretty brief, but essentially compassion fatigue is something that happens with people who work in helping professions. It's a response that we have when we're exposed to trauma. And you guys are exposed to trauma all the time, by the kids in care, the bio families, the system. There's a lot of trauma that you guys see by being foster parents. So what happens is all this trauma is a lot, and it just adds on and adds on, and you guys can struggle to cope over time. You guys get, because your emotions are just taken up, you start to get exhausted, and you're unable to just cope with day-to-day things. This is completely normal, and I think we don't talk about it very often. And then it makes you feel kind of like you're on an island when it actually does happen. So secondary trauma is when you actually start taking on some of the trauma symptoms that happen with our kids or families or system. And burnout together equal compassion fatigue. So we talked about compassion fatigue and burnout and work-related traumatic stress. There is also compassion satisfaction, which is the positive aspects you guys get from being foster parents. And I mean, you have those, otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. So burnout, you can feel completely emotionally depleted, um, emotionally exhausted. Inefficacy happens. You feel helpless or hopeless. I think a lot of times people start feeling this when the system, they start seeing that the system isn't working the way they feel like it should. And they're doing all they can for the kids. Maybe the schools aren't working the way they should. And you just start feeling like, what can I even do? How can I even keep doing this? And I think this compassion fatigue leads a lot of foster parents to stop fostering, sadly, but we don't talk about it. And I think you guys are afraid to, tell workers because then you think the workers might not put placements with you. It's a whole cycle, but it is something that's completely normal. Some of the symptoms are as if nothing you can do will help. You're tired, feel like a failure, like you're not doing your job well, frustrated, cynical, disconnected, depressed, like you need to drink more. I do want to play this quick video. I think we'll be about done and wrapped up just because this video is about something called blocked care. And essentially, when you start hitting compassion fatigue and these boundaries start getting broken by kids, sometimes we struggle to connect to the kids that are placed in our home, and we don't have those feelings anymore of caregiver to kid. We're just blocked. We're just done with the kid, and it is completely normal, and I don't think anyone talks about it very much. So this is a quick, like, 2-minute video on what that looks like. There are some suggestions here, but they're pretty brief. But if you're interested, you can, like, Google blocked care, and there's some other things. But I just want to show you because I don't want you to feel like
Hi, good morning. My name's Nikki. Welcome to today's Coffee with Chosen. If you are parenting a child that's gone through trauma, you have likely experienced a time where you feel like you have literally given all of your physical and emotional resources and depleted them in trying to care for the unique needs of your child. Have you ever had a time where you even felt like you genuinely want to have more compassion, connection, and caring for your child, but you feel like you just can't, or that something is even blocking you from being able to do so? Dan Hughes, the creator of DDP, Dyadic Developmental Psychotherapy, actually has a term for this, and he calls it blocked care. What happens is, as caregivers, we have these hormones and chemicals that are released in our bodies, and they prime us for caregiving. They're kind of responsible, you can think, for those warm and fuzzy connecting feelings that we have with people. You can also think of them as kind of receiving chemicals, that they're replenished whenever we give something that feels good, and then when we're getting it back from that other person in return, building it up. Parents who have been under a lot of stress, or if you have a child that has a difficult time trusting or building attachments and relationships, often have these very depleted and not built up. And that imbalance can really cause you to feel a physical disconnect or feelings with your child. So how do we work on unblocking blocked care? The first thing would be to practice self-care. So the more that we can manage our own emotions, our own stress, the more capacity we will automatically be able to have for another person and their needs, and have empathy for them, which can help grow the bond. Another thing you can do is practice just even 10 minutes a day of one-on-one time with your child, doing something that you both enjoy. So even just little positive experiences that you can put in here can help build this up. My advice for one-on-one time would be this: make sure that you as the parent are in a good headspace to be able to do that. If I'm about to do it, sometimes I will take a jog just around my block real quick so that I can just kind of be feeling calm and not too stressed out, so that I can be in a good space to be present with my child and have patience if I need. If you are experiencing blotch care with your child, we would love to help you. Please reach out to us for support. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So I was just saying before that started that it is something that is very common. So please don't feel alone. Okay, so just a couple more things. Does burnout happen with foster parents? This came from a survey that was done with foster parents, so it's answers from you guys. Financial reasons. A lot of times you guys don't feel supported by your case team or your agency. Feeling isolated, not having supports who understand, not having time or space to yourself, and then feeling that lack of control with the child welfare system. Yeah, so secondary trauma I talked about briefly, but that's when you guys feel that distress or emotional disruption because of having that exposure to kids who have high trauma. It could even be from knowing the case, even knowing what happened to that kid through like case meetings and that kind of thing. So essentially, the symptoms are the same as PTSD symptoms. So just, fear, worry, being startled, the feeling that their trauma is yours. So there is a really good survey online, and you can go look this up. You can just type in professional quality of life scale, or you can go to proqual.org, and you can take this scale, and it will give you a score for compassion fatigue, burnout, secondary trauma, those three things, and it will tell you where you are on all three of those things. So it's super interesting. You score yourself. You just print it out and score yourself. But if you're interested in that, it can be really helpful in figuring out where you are on that. There are physical symptoms of secondary trauma, same as PTSD, headaches, digestive issues, muscle tension. You would have sleep issues, tiredness, fatigue. There's emotional issues, mood swings, restlessness, anxiety, depression, memory issues, struggling to make decisions. If you're isolating yourself, having more conflict in your life, being moody, hypervigilance. So some factors that can increase your vulnerability would be personal stress. If you already have physical or mental health problems, if your job is really high stress, if you work a lot, and if you struggle with having some of those resources available to you. So also, you guys struggle with self-care, and I don't mean that in a judgment way, but you guys do, because you tend to be natural caregivers. You guys are the ones who are always taking care of someone else. And then a lot of times, people come into your homes, caseworkers, family workers, and, ask what will help. And I think you guys don't know what would help you. So that's a barrier. And then I think sometimes you think you shouldn't need support. And I know this doesn't apply to all of you, but some of you. So there are some barriers to self-care with you guys. And then, so coping with compassion fatigue, basically take care of yourself. Get some good nutrition, sleep, physical activity. I know it's really hard. You're parenting really hard kids. You don't have time for all this stuff. Best thing you can do is try to sleep, get rest, stay hydrated. Here's just a couple more ideas. So it's very hard fostering. You guys are on an island sometimes. It's not the same as parenting sometimes. So having those parent connections isn't quite going to cut it. But if you can make time or efforts to connect with other foster parents, that's really helpful. I know like KVC has some Facebook pages per region. I don't know if other agencies do. That is sometimes helpful to just connect. If there's any way you can take some time alone, even if that's just in the shower, to just be alone. Respite is helpful. I know it's hard to get, but take it if you can. And then find something to look forward to. If you have a vacation in 3 months, 4 months, just Make that your, thing to look forward to. And then don't isolate from your family and friends. I know it's very easy to do, but find ways to stay connected. So, that is it. Those are my references. Let me see here.